Hi, so my name is Emily. I'm an associate at Emotion Ventures, which is the venture capital arm of Jaguar Land Rover. So we were set up around 3 years ago to invest in early stage businesses across transport, mobility, and travel. And the rationale for setting the fund was that we're seeing a massive disruption in those three sectors, with people owning less and less cars and rely on just different methods of transportation. And so we've invested in the last 3 years in 16 businesses globally across various segments of mobility, whether that's ride-hailing or autonomous vehicle systems or journey planners. We've looked at a lot of different businesses, and we have about half of our portfolio in the States, the other half in Europe, mostly in the UK because that's where we're based. But we've got one investment in Berlin and another investment in Tel Aviv.
Harry.
I'm not Richard, I'm Harry. I work for Bird. Richard sends his apologies, but he's not very well today, so you have a stand-in, so hopefully I will do a good job. I run comms in EMEA for Bird. We are an electric scooter sharing app. We are in 120 cities globally. We're only 18 months old as a business, so still relatively young, but we've created quite an impact. Before Bird, I was at Uber, so quite familiar with lots of themes that we'll be hopefully talking about today from two companies.
Yeah, I'm James Dotson. I'm a principal technologist at the Connected Places catapults. There are 10 catapults in the UK focused on different market areas where the government wants us to excel globally. So the Connected Places catapult focuses on intelligent mobility and smart cities. And I've focused on this new innovation area called mobility as a service for the last 3 years. How we operate is we're not-for-profit, and we work with big and small businesses as well as universities to commercialize and take new ideas to market.
Hi, I'm Melina. I'm the Managing Director for 100 Resilient Cities for Europe and the Middle East. 100 Resilient Cities is an initiative from the Rockefeller Foundation, and we work with 100 city administrations from all over the world in supporting them in building their urban resilience, their capacity to address future shocks and stresses.
So Emily, how can the latest tech investment put London business on the world stage?
So I think if you look at last year's investments that went into the London tech sphere, it's actually reached 8.8 billion in 2018 alone. So that's across all sectors. And we've only focused on transport and mobility, as I said before. But in mobility, it trickles down into various different facets of transportation. So just to give a few examples, companies that are developing the technology for autonomous vehicles here in London are like Exotica, 5AI, Humanizing Autonomy. They've raised very large rounds. Then you've got companies that are developing shared methods of transportation like Zillow and Snap. You've got companies that are developing journey planners like Citymapper, which are getting just massive amounts of attention. And this is really important because it fuels this virtuous circle where more capital attracts more talent, which then attracts more capital. And these success stories are really important also to promote entrepreneurship and to get the wheel spinning and actually sort of promote entrepreneurship as something that is possible in London. But that said, I think London is already a fantastic place to be as an entrepreneur. You've got a really high concentration of talent, of resources, and I'm thinking of not only VCs, but also accelerators and incubators like Founders Factory or EF or Zinc VC, which focuses on social impact and tech for good. So I think we're in a really, really good place here in London, and it's our job to just keep the community vibrant.
I guess in the call that we had last week, I think Richard, who's now Harry, had a slightly contrary view.
Yeah, no, I just think from our point of view, obviously, the big elephant in the room is that our business is not legal in the UK, right? So I think it's great. London is my home city. We do have a pilot on private land in the Olympic Park, which you're all welcome to come and try out because it's excellent. But look, when you look around London, you see a city that is, the congestion is unbelievable. I think the average speed of a car in London now is about 6 miles an hour. Our air quality is pretty bad. Ironically, I think the European Court are going to sue us for air quality, and I'm not sure that's going to work in the next few months. So I think that we kind of have a product that is specifically designed to get people out of cars, get them onto something that is more environmentally friendly, and really make cities better. We're in 120 cities around the world. It's working well in places like Paris and Madrid, etc. But yet we can't launch here. So the investment is great, but I do think we also need to be a bit more open to kind of new forms of transport and stuff like that, because we don't need any more cars necessarily on our roads, I wouldn't have thought.
Well, I mean, we articulated earlier that there's a tension here a little bit from the moniker of London is open and actually the reality of I guess, the current legislation framework. And I guess for someone who isn't aware of how things currently stand for the business, where do things stand in terms of burden here in the UK?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, look, we're getting there. Everyone we've spoken to is like TfL are great. We have a good relationship with them. We also have a good relationship with the Department of Transport, and we meet and talk to them about the issues that face us. I think probably, the last 6 months and the next 6 months is probably the worst time in history to try and get any legislation through Parliament. And unfortunately, we need primary legislation in order to operate. So there's not a quick answer, but we just need to keep plodding away. I think interestingly, we launched in Brussels at the kind of end of last year, November time last year, and the city of Antwerp called us the next day and said, you've just launched in Brussels. We want you in Antwerp as well. But we couldn't launch in Antwerp because there was a city regulation. I appreciate in London it's a slightly bigger issue. There's a city regulation that forbade it, and we got a call about a week later from the alderman saying, we've changed the law, can you launch now? So within 3 weeks of us not being able to launch and it being not legal for us to launch, we went from launching the service, and actually it's now one of our most flourishing cities in Europe. So where there's a will, there is certainly kind of a way to get it done. I think as soon as people recognise the advantages that a service like ours can bring, then hopefully the door's open.
And I suppose there's a little bit of tension between the responsibilities of TfL and the constraints that they operate under. And I think, James, you look back in terms of the historical view of TfL when we spoke about it last week. Is that right?
Yeah, so if you look at transport planners working for city and highway authorities, in the 80s and 90s it was about road building and predict and provide for the car. And then there was a big change between not moving vehicles but moving people. And TfL was really progressive back then, looking at optimizing their assets for people movement rather than specifically car movement. And I think that was a really progressive move. And obviously TfL, again, led the world in many ways in terms of integrated ticketing and an integrated multimodal service. And if you talk to TfL, they obviously are proud that mobility as a service is already here. It's a very connected, integrated transport system, and you feel that you do get a mobility service from TfL. I think the challenge for cities that were ahead in the 90s is now we have a lot more private sector investment, we have a lot more digitalization, new technologies, new hardware and software, and business models. And it's how can the cities protect the needs of all of their citizens and their stakeholders and their voters and us, as well as get the best from the private sector and the best from this cutting-edge innovation.
Harry, I suspect you often see TfL as a partner, but I think, James, you actually articulate some of the challenges that TfL faces, given where it is in the ecosystem.
Yeah, so if we look at Transport for London's obviously a unique case in the UK, but their revenue model is around the services that they sell, the underground buses. They're absolutely key to their business model. To give that up and to hand over the opportunity for all of the innovation to flow into those modes to improve customer experience, to sort of hand that over to the private sector is a very concerning thing.
Yeah, I do think that 1 in 8 Londoners live in an area that is not that convenient for public transport. So I do think I think TfL are great, and I use their services every day. However, I do think there is still a slight disconnect between when you get to your tube and your house might be still a bit too far away to walk. There's still that kind of last mile issue. In fact, I was going to tell a story about my colleague, but you'd obviously know it was Richard because there's only 2 of us in the UK. But he drives to work every day because he lives, it would take him 20 minutes to walk to his nearest tube stop. And if a service like Bird, for example, was around, what you'd see is he would jump on a scooter in the morning, go to the tube, leave it there, get on the tube to the other end, and then jump on a scooter when he got to the other end, and then get to work, right? So it actually, I think the private sector can really help TfL connect the dots of what's currently missing. When you look at our service in Paris, a third of all of our trips is someone either going from or to a public transport hub. So, I mean, it can definitely help fill those gaps. And actually, put more people onto the public transit as opposed to take them off.
Melina, I guess stepping back and sort of listening to this thus far, what do you think?
So the question was how we can use the advancements to put the businesses of London at the world stage. But the question is, in order to do so, you need to ensure that London is actually a place where people want to work, live, and raise their families. So yes, central London is one of the most connected places in the world, but the outer areas of London have very, very limited opportunities for transportation. And this creates isolation to the communities, and this creates additional stresses, and this creates a city actually that is less socially connected and integrated. So given that London's foresight is that it will grow to almost 11 million by 2040. So the stakes are high here of what kind of city we want to have and where do we want to see London flourish. So I think that the question is also for the panels, how we can use these technologies, how we can use this innovation without losing also the target, which is a livable city.
Does anyone have an answer to that question?
I agree.
I think cities need to focus on where they have leverage, where they are the ones, the only ones that can control something in all these new business ecosystems. And the thing that they can control is the thing that we've all paid our taxes into since the year dot. It's the infrastructure. Getting involved in smart ticketing, in transport services, in journey planning apps. Government has dabbled in all of these different aspects of innovation. But the only thing that government has to do and must do right is to almost sell their infrastructure into other business models. And it's by selling their infrastructure as a service to the people that they want to use it in the ways they want to use it is potentially the most efficient way to improve livability of cities, address congestion, and address potential market failures from things that we all love as consumers, such as on-demand taxi, to things that society needs, which is a functioning transport system. So I think to focus on infrastructure as a service within this as a service big business model that's sort of moving from software to everything else is something that cities really need to take seriously. It's a great revenue generator, and it's potentially the best way to turn the dials on how you manage supply and demand across a very complicated system.
I guess moving away from a discussion around London as a city, and I guess refocusing the attention on some of the businesses that are in the audience, I suppose if I'm listening to this, I might be wondering, where are those opportunities or challenges for my business? And I wonder whether you had a particular perspective, James, because the whole point of Catapult, if you correct me wrong, is to catapult those new ideas into the marketplace, whether they come from the universities or the SMEs, and you work with big business. So I wonder what's your perspective on that?
So yeah, in terms of opportunities, direct economic opportunities is to take the huge dominant market player in mobility, which is car ownership. We spend over 100 billion a year in the UK as households on travelling, on transport. The lion's share of that is around car ownership and that business model. And offering us as consumers better ways to travel, redistributing some of that revenue into what is potentially an inefficient use of resources. Our cars are parked 90% of the time, only one seat in 4 is used, etc., etc. So I think the direct economic opportunities is for the innovators and businesses to say, don't own a car, spend your money with me, spend your money on my mobility service. I will give you something that is better than car ownership. The indirect benefits are all the things we know about smart cities and internalizing these negatives in terms of congestion, air quality, and all the things that sort of the open access problem of transport is causing us. So I think there's massive opportunities.
I think to point if there are entrepreneurs that are looking to start businesses and stuff like that, I mean, you do have to start thinking about whether, especially if you're in the micromobility sector, whether London is the right place to do it. And like, just talk about the regulation, for example. Like, if you wanted to come up with a great new service that would kind of displace the car, you'd struggle a bit here unless it was a bicycle or a horse. There's not much else that you can actually put on the road. So you do have to think carefully about the vehicle that you're trying to use and how you'd go about getting it out there.
Yep. And to your point, it's actually a very competitive space. So if you look at the deployment of mobility services across major cities in the world, you'll find that there are dozens of services that are competing for customer attention. So just in London in the last 10 years, we've had Uber, we have micromobility isn't making it to London, but hopefully soon. But you also have Zip cars, like car rental companies, and just Boris bikes even in the last 10 years. So you really have this explosion of the mobility services that are competing for customer attention. And I think one really interesting framework to understand is that the whole industry is moving towards this one-stop shop of mobility framework. And so we're seeing this narrative sort of over and over again. So for instance, you have two different ways to get to this one-stop shop of mobility. It's through verticalization. So you've got Uber and Lyft, for instance, that are moving towards adjacent services like bikes or scooters to sort of create this one app that you just go back to for all of your transport services. They have actually integrated, I think last month, public transit ticketing in Denver as a pilot to just see how it goes. You've got Lyft that is kind of following the same trend. And then on the other side, the second strategy is aggregation. So you've got journey planners like Transit or Citymapper that are creating this one interface for you to see all the different mobility services that are around you. So for instance, if you want to go to King's Cross, you can compute your route and see if maybe a Lime bike is better or a drum bike, or you can just sort of see the different services that is at play. And these third parties are actually great for a new mobility service because it creates a level playing field with the bigger players, because you're actually competing just in terms of maybe how close your asset is to that person or for price, but you're no longer competing for customer acquisition in the same way that Uber and Lyft are. So there are opportunities and challenges.
So if the first strategy that a business owner can employ might be verticalization, what was the second one?
So it's just kind of understanding the dynamic of aggregation and the third players playing that role, and so maybe getting closer to journey planners, to Citymapper, to Transit, to integrate your service in their app.
I think, I guess as Londoners, I think we often assume that London is the center of the universe, of which of course it's not. But I think one of the perspectives, indeed.
I thought it was.
So one of the perspectives I think that Lina provides is the spectrum of cities that 100 Resilient Cities has worked with. So I wonder, sort of looking away from this sort of London bubble, what do you see?
So first of all, there are opportunities, but also there are challenges. And just to stick on the opportunity side, like the Finland example has been the poster child of mobility as a service globally, and the success has been driven by a strong commitment from governments from all scales, whether it's the city government and the way that they manage their data, whether it's the central government, and Finland just passed a law where every transportation operator needs to open up their ticketing systems to a third party. But also there are challenges, and it's almost like an anecdote, but it's what happened in Paris in 2007, which is what you need to get it right from start. So in Paris, the bike sharing system and the car sharing system, the first phases failed completely. And now that they relaunched the Lib and Autolib that are more efficient, but still the city and the operators need to make the case and change the perception to the citizens. Because the citizens have the perception that this don't work. It's almost like it was a joke in Paris to use the bike sharing system. Or a second challenge that we need to be aware of is the data issue and how citizens at this point understand their privacy and their data and how this has been used, and being able to explain why, to what end, what is the additional value that all of this will bring to our world.
We mentioned Tel Aviv as a good example, and I know you, Emily, have made an investment there, and I wonder, Lena, if you can mention your Tel Aviv example, but also, Emily, talk about, I guess, some of the activity you have in the sort of Tel Aviv space as well.
Sure. So in Tel Aviv, we've been working in Tel Aviv, and our example is not transportation related, but it's related in terms of how the city supports and works with startups and with the technological ecosystem. And Tel Aviv has become a strong advocate, bringing all these startups that are in the city and being able to create this kind of pilots and showcase them worldwide. And we worked, and this launched a couple of weeks ago, which is the Tel Aviv Coin, which is the digital currency. And this started by a grassroots movement and a startup. And in the city, within a couple of weeks, they were able to structure a partnership and in time for the Eurovision contest to actually launch a whole campaign for their digital currency.
Yeah, and in terms of Tel Aviv, so we look at the Israeli market, and we've actually invested in an Israeli fund about 2 years ago to get more visibility of this market. And frankly, it's one market that I find fascinating, how just such a small country can generate so much activity in the tech space and just become in just a matter of few years a leading tech hub. It is really, really interesting. So in terms of mobility as a service, I haven't seen a lot of companies actually do that in Tel Aviv. The real strength of the Israeli market is in cybersecurity and deep tech, which they're just incredibly good at. And if you sort of aggregate all the investments that are made in cybersecurity, connected car, autonomous vehicle systems, etc., in Europe versus Israel, it's incredible how much of the market they have.
I think I guess again, putting myself in the audience's shoes, I think quite often I hear about the importance of the customer experience. And actually, I think looking back to our discussion, James, you mentioned the customer experience as one of the key opportunities for cities themselves. I wonder if you wanted to say a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really talk about customer experience in transport, do we? Because it's full of pain points. I think so. We did a traveller needs study, where we interviewed lots of people. We surveyed 10,000 people and asked them about their journeys, and I think 75% of journeys had some pain points, whether it's I can't park, I'm not connecting, etc., etc. So, we're now seeing transport operators recruiting customer experience teams and directors, but they've obviously got a long way to go. What's really interesting is the disruptors in this space are normally competing purely on a better customer experience, and Uber's, the Uber experience, the Uber app, we're all used to it now, but when it first came out, it was, for many people, wow, this is just so convenient. I think the question is, can cities and city authorities and more widely the public sector ever get as good as the private sector at really, really good customer experience? Because that's what we want as citizens. We want customer experience. What cities want is, yes, to please us, but they also have to help us all work together. And when you all leave tonight, we don't want fights over the taxi or the bird. You know, we all need to work together in a shared space within our cities.
I guess looking at that tension, that whether or not, sort of whether it's private business or public bodies, I wonder what the panel thinks about that dichotomy.
I mean, a nice way to look at it maybe is, would we want Amazon to run our transport system? I mean, they've done a great job at running lots of other aspects of our lives. Maybe individually we would, but maybe collectively we wouldn't. And these sorts of questions are going to come up more and more as some of the big platform business models that rely on network effects and rely on scale in what is a market that none of us actually want to travel. We only travel to get to where we need to go to. If we didn't have to travel, it would be even better, wouldn't it? So in a market that is all about scale and low margins, how do we reconcile attracting investment with the fact that we all want our systems to work and we have finite space, finite supply of assets, but massive changes in demand depending on what the latest, newest new mobility service is?
Yeah, I think the problem with obviously a private company doing it is that there needs to be a lot of data sharing from all the kind of transport companies, right? So is Uber going to give all of their data to a third-party company so people can book Ubers through that, and also trust that data is safe when they're connected to Bird or however many other mobility transport companies that are on one app, really. So I think the whole thing is, yeah, I mean, I think mobility as a service is a perfect thing in theory, but I think then, you know, when you get into the nitty-gritty of it, I mean, if the government were to run it completely, will they put enough resource behind it with, you know, current funding and stuff like that to make sure it is the best it can be? So you do get that kind of service that you get when you open Bird or Uber or a similar app to that. So it's kind of it's a tricky one.
So, again, putting myself in the shoes of the audience, I'm thinking, okay, this sounds interesting, but I'm looking to perhaps exploit this for revenue targets. What are the new products that might spawn out of this? And I wonder, I guess, Emily, from your perspective of an investor that's looking at this sector, so what do you see?
So frankly, we're seeing a lot of different monetization models. I think one key thing that I took out of this is that the market is still in its infancy and you're getting a lot of experimentation still. And I mean, frankly, even the leaders like Uber and Lyft haven't really figured it out. So, you know, there's still room to improve. I think the main monetization models that we see are pay as you go. So kind of figuring out what the price sensitivity of the user is per journey. Then you're also seeing rewards platforms incentivizing a certain behavior of users by providing them with like small rewards per journey, for instance, or things like that. And then one model that is getting a lot of attention now is subscriptions, which are often talked about as the Netflix of transport, although that really is just a subscription. It's the same. But so we're seeing a lot of that, and that, frankly, I think it's very hard to pull off at scale. But then the rewards that you get are also great because you get more customer loyalty and you sort of lock the customer in, for lack of better words. But yeah, it's not to say that we don't care about the monetization model, but it's just for an early stage company in transport and mobility, you just have room to test out different models and see what sticks. And I think customer engagement for that type of business is really what we look for a seed company, looking for product market fit. And just, you know, we want to see a product that customers love, that brings values, that cities encourage, and that just gets a lot of traction.
I guess in some ways that's somewhat counterintuitive, I guess, from what we might expect you to say. I think yes. I was surprised on the call
That's
last
not
week.
To say that VCs don't care about
revenue. Of course.
But yeah, I think we just want to see really good customer engagement, and then it's for later investments that actually it becomes to matter substantially.
Is there a good example from, I guess, your existing portfolio where you see actually that's the way in which we foresee that particular business developing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a company for a company that can get millions of customers to use their app every single day, customers that come back over and over again, for a long period of time with really good retention rates, even if they haven't figured out fully their revenue or just monetization strategy, that has value, and investors know that has value. Now, of course, we'll push for revenue and for actually making this work, but it's just kind of having a holistic view of the business, right? I mean, you can get great revenue, but from a very sort of small niche of customers, one-off revenue, and customers don't come back, and then that's not exactly the same value. So, yeah.
I think when Harry and I first spoke about this event, I think almost a couple of months ago, I think we started a discussion talking about your platform, which we have not discussed yet. And I suppose as an example of a way in which a business that's operated in the UK, started from the US, fastest company to get to £1 billion valuation in 6 months, 2 billion. I wonder whether the audience might be interested to hear your story around things around your platform and what you're doing there.
Yeah, sure. So we obviously launched, we started in Santa Monica. So whenever I'm on conference calls with the head office, in the background I just see kind of beaches and palm trees, and I'm sitting by a canal in East London. It's not quite the same. So we started over there and grew very quickly. We very, very quickly realized that this was a product that people wanted to use. Like, it gets you there quicker than a car, doesn't pollute, and a side effect of that is that it's really, really good fun as well. So when you say no one likes the journey, come and try one of our scooters, because you'll love it. And the problem we had obviously was scaling the business. So lots of cities wanted us there. We're invited to go to lots of cities, but we kind of didn't have the resources to go as quickly as we wanted. So we introduced Bird Platform, which essentially it's almost a white label. So if you are a small business in Copenhagen or a small city like that, or another city like that, and you want to get into this sector, but you know the local market, but perhaps you don't want to kind of create your own scooters, and you don't want to employ engineers to run it for you, you can essentially approach us, and we will give you all the tools you need really to launch your business. So you'll get the scooters, you'll get the app, you can white label it to your own brand. So the scooters are all kind of have different names, etc. So it's one of the ways actually we found of scaling quite quickly without obviously having to have the infrastructure in every city well, not the infrastructure, but provided by us. So it was a very quick way for us to generate an awful lot of scale quite quickly in cities. So it was it's certainly an interesting way of getting kind of the scale that we wanted as quickly as we did.
Barcelona, I believe, was another interesting example as well.
We started the kind of the shared scooter business, which is the kind of the one that we have in Paris, etc. And very quickly realised that people that use the scooters a lot were sometimes when you open your front door, there might not be one nearby, and that slightly defeats the point. So for people that use it a lot and use it to commute every day, we started this bird rental scheme where for, I think it's $30 or 30 euros a month, you rent a scooter from us, and then it's yours. So you can take it into your house with you at night, charge it. So when you come downstairs in the morning, you know that there's one there. So you can get to your tube and off you go. So you always have a scooter available to you. And then following from that, actually recently we introduced a first scooter that you can buy as well. So we've kind of gone from the kind of shared scooter to the rent, and then we kind of thought, well, actually, some people really want to have one of these scooters. I mean, it's I would say it's probably one of the best around, just because we've taken data from 10 odd million trips that we've done, and kind of used all of that knowledge to create what is essentially kind of like the perfect scooter, if you will. So huge demand for that as well. So in countries where people use scooters really frequently and regularly, you can now buy one and have it shipped over. Even if it's a country where we haven't launched any services yet, you can still get the kind of bird experience.
It sounds like you've learned a lot in what must be at least 18 months. And I wonder, for that annoying question, what would you, looking back, what have you learned that you think, I really wish we knew that?
Yeah, I think we have made some quite good steps. I think that one of the first things that we did was to put cities first. So we kind of viewed almost cities were our number one customer, because we wanted to help them solve their congestion issues, their air quality issues, as well as providing a service for customers. So I think putting cities first was something we did really well. I think another key learning that we learned, it wasn't really from Bird, but looking at kind of other dockless services. There were some bike sharing schemes, for example, I'm sure you're familiar with. And they fell out with a lot of cities because they arrived on the first day, and you'd open your curtains in the morning, there's kind of 2,000 yellow bikes dotted around the streets, and it pisses a lot of people off, pardon my French. So what we do is we always kind of start relatively small. So Brussels, again, is an example where we launched with 100 scooters, and that was it, in a city the size of Brussels. And then only when those ones are being used enough do we add more to the system. So that way, hopefully you avoid having scooters lying around and they're being used more than they are. And a few other things, every night we take them in, check them for maintenance and stuff like that. So after kind of 10, 11 o'clock, the streets are kind of empty of scooters and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that we learned, possibly not from making the mistakes ourselves, but just looking at other industries or similar kind of industries, seeing what they did wrong, and then try not to make those same mistakes.
I think before I ask Lena about that sort of collaboration model between businesses and cities, I'm intrigued to hear what is an error that Bird has made. It sounds great thus far, so I just wonder whether there's anything actually that you've done wrong.
Do you know what what have we done wrong? I mean, yeah, obviously we followed a competitor into a city in the US, into San Francisco, because they launched, and we thought, well, if they can do it and no one's stopping them, surely we can as well. So anyway, the city obviously then decided to stop both of us from operating, then launched a tender process, which two companies won that were neither of us or our competitor, but that hadn't really done it before either. So it was a bit of a kind of interesting one. So yeah, obviously we made mistakes there, but we learned from those pretty quickly. We pretty much always now go into a city when we've got the blessing of that city.
It sounds like you've really internalized that putting city first lesson.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
There are lots of American startup apps that have perhaps disrupted Europe in the past, and we were keen not to do that again.
Thank you. I guess going back to that sort of word of collaboration, Lena, I think one of the advantages is that you have such a broad scope of cities that you engage with. So I guess if I'm a sort of business leader in the audience thinking, okay, well, I'm bought into this sector, I know it's something I want to do, but how can I sort of better collaborate with municipalities? I wonder what your perspective might be on that.
So first of all, there are lessons learned about that, but there are not established best practices, because still everything is under experimentation, and things that we now say is a best practice, in a couple of months we might reflect back about that. But there are a few things, and one of the things that is the easiest is trying to understand what is the best legal instrument for the partnership, and what is the best legal mechanism according to what you want to do. Because MOUs are nice and very easy, but it's just for the first pilot. It's to start with. What is the second case? And Harry mentioned about a city can put out an RFP, but a city can do other stuff. I was like, well, create like a permit structure. And I have an interesting case from Seattle in the US that have a very interesting permit structure that is, they've put together a framework that is permanent, it is performance focused, it creates, the regulatory framework that is needed, but at the same time, it leaves the market open for competition, and in order to ensure that there are multiple consumer products available to citizens. At the same time, Seattle, while having that, they want to ensure that their targets are met. Their targets towards equity, towards ensuring access to communities with disabilities. So for example, in this permit structure, they've said, if the operator is able to have adaptive bicycles, This was in terms of their dockless bike share system. If they have adaptive bicycles in the fleet, then they take additional permits, like 1,000 permits on top of it. And they've done it also, at the same time, they're creating a very robust guidelines on how they can manage and design the curbs, the pavements in the cities. So all of it together, it creates an ecosystem, it creates an environment where you can have stable partnerships. And then another interesting example is how do you structure your the fees? There are many ways to do it, like per vehicle, per trip, per permit. So, for example, doing it per trip, it creates like a mutual incentives from both sides that this needs to be successful. And then there is an interesting case in Portland where they created this almost like a fund where all the fees that they generate through this kind of mobility schemes, they reinvest them for their infrastructure. They reinvest them in order to create educational kits and awareness to the communities. So the cities support the operators and vice versa. So, of course, these are difficult things, and it's different how a medium-sized city in Europe can handle this versus a global metropolis as London, Europe versus the US. We are still in this process, but I think it is important, and it is important for both cities to understand how the startups work and what are the elements that they need to discuss and what they need to get out of, and at the same time, the startups need to have the expertise to navigate these, yes, in very many cases, very complicated, and yes, in many cases, very obsolete frameworks.
I think one really interesting thing about e-scooters is that they're a kind of intelligent, connected electronic vehicle, and that opens up lots of new ways that city authorities can start to watch, regulate, manage them. I mean, the idea of dockless bike share, bike litter. We've all seen the piles of bikes in China. A scooter can fall over.
It can.
A scooter probably has a gyroscope in it, or could have. How would Bird and other similar companies feel, for example, if the data in real time from every scooter that had fallen over was kind of on a meter in the city, ticking up pounds and pounds of fines?
Well, we kind of,
as an example.
Yeah, no, we have a platform called GovTech, which is if you work for that city, you get access to our platform, where you can essentially see all of this kind of data. So to answer your question, yeah, when things like scooters tip over, and obviously you can't help strong wind or a young kid that just wants to push over. But we also have people on the streets in the cities that we operate in. So in Paris, for example, there's a team of people who are just on the streets, and what they will do is, if a scooter does fall over, they're made aware of it, they will go and move it within an hour. So it's gone and it's put somewhere more sensible. Similarly, if it's kind of parked blocking a sidewalk, pavement. Sorry, I keep forgetting where I am. It will be moved, and we also have, we also rely quite a lot on the community of riders we have. So if you have the Bird app, the thing called community mode on there, which you can open, and you can tell us if a scooter's parked badly. You can tell us if someone's been riding irresponsibly, that kind of stuff. And so we can kind of take actions, all those things. And to your point, yeah, like the geo-fencing stuff that we have is it's incredible. So, for example, our pilot on the Olympic Park, we've got a route that we've agreed with the landowner, and if you scoot off it, the scooter will just slow down and stop, and then it's useless. You've got to go back into the zone where you're allowed to ride. So obviously it stops people from going on public roads and stuff like that where they're currently illegal. So we can do lots of those kinds of things.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
Because in terms of data, so the Los Angeles, Santa Monica, and I think Philadelphia as well, had a system, and the cities had a system that were able to see in real time all the trips that were happening from the different mobility and micro-mobility operators, and being able to do this kind of real-time decision-making of how to move the fleets. Then the state, especially in California, the state came banning this system because it said that there's an issue of privacy. So, and that's why I'm saying, like, best case. So this was a best case 2 months ago, and now it's a question mark whether the cities will continue doing that. So yeah, so there's always a question about
so,
it.
Yeah, so like the data that we have is generally all aggregated, so that, and that we show the city, so you wouldn't know a person, an individual that had taken a trip somewhere, for example. But what it does mean, obviously, if you can see that you have really popular routes that scooter users use, then there's probably a public transport issue there, right? So what you can do is city planners can then look at this data and think, do you know what, if we just tweet, the number 22 bus that went around here, you would pick up a lot more people and it'd be a more efficient route. So it's super helpful when it comes to city planners that they can look at this information and just see how they can tweak their systems. I think the advantage that Dockless has over Docked is, of course, things move, right? So there is, you obviously see lots of Santander cycle things around London, which are great, but they're concrete into the ground. So if a big new development goes up, there might not be bikes. Let's say at Battersea Power Station, for example. What we can do is we can move our fleet around. So if lots of people move from one area to another, you're not going to dig up all the concrete and move the Dockless bike, the docked bike. But what you can do is just be more fluid with our kind of fleet of scooters and put them really where they're needed.
I think looking at a case study that perhaps isn't Bird. I think, James, one of the interesting things that, like you mentioned when we spoke, was that you catapult, and perhaps you were involved in the first testing of autonomous vehicles in Milton Keyes, I believe it was. I wonder if you can tell the audience about that, but also was there anything that came out of that the audience might want to hear?
Yeah, I mean, the main reason why what was then the Transport Systems Catapult facilitated the first trial on highway, which was actually footway, of the first fully autonomous vehicle, was really through working with the local highway authority, Milton Keynes, and to an extent government, was to show industry that the UK wanted to help this new innovation grow, and was happy to test. And since then, there's been a lot of on-road testing. So of course we need to test these new mobility services, and I think in the UK we've got a situation where it's illegal to have e-scooters.
As one that perhaps goes by.
He doesn't know.
No.
It's fine.
There's two options, isn't there? There's to look at best practice, which has its challenges, as we've heard, of how other states and cities are regulating. Or there's options to do trials in the UK to collect an evidence base on which to regulate through smart electronic data sharing ways or more traditional permits and licensing ways. What we see in scooters, or what I see in scooters, is a great fun mode, whether it's a push scooter or an e-scooter, and it has huge benefits, and it's definitely got a place in the kind of ecosystem of vehicles, from Hyperloop to GoPed and hoverboard eventually.
I think what's interesting actually is when you look around Europe, so Germany's changed the law this summer to allow it. Spain already has, Portugal has, Antwerp already has, Italy is. So you kind of think, if all these countries are changing the rules to allow it, there is obviously definitely some good in this. So I think we just need to keep banging the drum here.
Yeah. And I think scooters are also getting a lot of bad press for the wrong reasons. I think it's just because people are not really used to seeing these on the streets, but we're just used to a certain way of traveling, right? And I think it's pretty absurd to see a lot of people raging over a scooter which is poorly parked, when actually, if you look around you, it's absurd that we have so many cars parked that sit idle 95% of the time and that take a lot of space on our roads. So I think there's also a big step in just changing our mentality of how we travel in cities, and that will take time. But I think it's changing rapidly. I think it's always good to take a step back and see where we were 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, in 2009, we didn't even have real-time information on buses and just other public transit modes. And today we've got city planner, journey planners that tell you exactly where to go. You've got Uber that launched. You have Boris bikes, other modes of mobility which are trying to get out. I mean, it's incredible how much variety we have. We've never had this much variety in London. And it has yet to reach other parts of the country, that's for sure. But I think we'll get there.
To that point, it's quite funny. If you look back, we were laughing about some old press clippings that were from when cars started to take over in cities. And if you read them and just replace car for scooter, it could be some of the stories you see today of like, these things are ridiculous, they're in the way, and and you kind of think that they're talking about the car. And now it's just completely second nature that they're just around us all the time. You just become desensitized to it.
Well, in the end of the 19th century, London had the major crisis, which was the horse manure crisis. They did a whole conference in New York to try to solve horse manure, and they couldn't find any solutions. They were like, "Oh, it's the end of civilization," and these were things that they were poisoning, the civilians. And then Henry Ford came and created the car. So the question is that we are in such a 5 years ago, we didn't have all of these, and we do now. We don't know what future will bring. So how do we create this kind of frameworks? And that's a very difficult discussion in cities, in governments, even in our, start thinking about that. Frameworks that can work regardless of the technology, because technology changes all the time, but cities and governments are like our elephants. So you change them from the one side, but then it will be very difficult to change on the other side. So how do you create this kind of adaptive policy making?
I think that's a very interesting question, perhaps to take into the networking period. And I think just keeping an eye on time before I give the audience an opportunity to ask you questions, I wanted to just focus on, I guess, the final element of the discussion. And I think this is really focusing on the perspective of the investor, who I think is quite ably represented by Emily in this instance. So I guess looking at, thinking about some of the biggest market opportunities, where do you see those opportunities for mobility and smart transportation businesses?
So that's a really tough question to answer, because mobility is such a large umbrella terms for very, very different sectors. And I guess I could talk about this endlessly, but just to give a little snaps over what we're interested in. We're obviously very interested by autonomous vehicles and how that will shape up in the future. Now, I think we're also seeing in the industry that people are realizing just how much time it's going to take. But I think thinking about the experience of the autonomous car and how that's going to happen is something that's super interesting. Not only thinking about sensors and how the car perceives pedestrians, et cetera, because that's a given, but also thinking of the experience inside the car. So what will happen when you actually step into a vehicle that doesn't have a driver, in terms of security, but also in terms of materials. How does the self-driving car self-clean, or things like this? Like thinking about the full experience is something that we look at. We're also super interested in anything related to electrification, because the world is moving electric, but the issue is that you currently don't have the infrastructure that is in place, and you've got a chicken and egg problem where people are ready to buy a car, but because the infrastructure isn't in place, people aren't buying electric cars, and the infrastructure is just not there. But I think in the next few years we'll find a lot of new innovative services that can help the charging issue, whether that's in battery technology and building better batteries that last longer, or fast chargers, or wireless charging. I think we'll see a lot of solutions popping up from that. Also things that tackle urbanization and congestion, so anything related to smart city is something that we look at. So because you can't really improve the infrastructure as easily, we have to find ways to put more people in public transit systems and outside of their cars. So we're looking at solutions like smart traffic management, or startups that are analyzing the patterns of demand to optimize bus routes, et cetera. those are super interesting to us as well. So as you can see, it's a very varied response because the sectors are so different from one another. And we also see micromobility as being something really disruptive and changing the way that we travel around. But yeah, I think there's so many great opportunities in mobility, and it's really a sector that's ripe for disruption.
I think in some ways I suspect individuals often look at InMotion and see the Jaguar Land Rover moniker and assume actually, and I wonder whether strategic reasons are influencing sort of the investments you make within your portfolio. And I wonder in the spectrum between, I guess, corporate and sort of venture capitalism and traditional venture capital, where do you lie?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's obviously a question that we get a lot, and the way we've done things, that we've actually separated InMotion into two functions. So we've got one part of InMotion that creates mobility services from scratch, and these are very closely linked to the core business. So they launched a business called The Out, which is a car rental delivery of Land Rover and vehicles. And they're quite separate from us, and whereas then you have the corporate VC team that I'm part of, which invest in mobility services that are just sitting outside of JLR, and we have a clear just a clear separation in that we'll invest for financial return, and then we can obviously facilitate strategic ties to the core business if that's what the founding team wants. But we're also happy not to do that. We're very flexible in our way of working with startups. But yeah, you're right. I think it's important for us to embrace our JLR logo, because that's where we come from. But we are also looking for solutions for the future of mobility and transportation in cities, and that goes sometimes outside of car ownership, and that's totally fine.
And just before I open up the discussion to include the audience, I think one of the interesting things that we discussed was actually the tension between traditional transportation businesses and traditional businesses. I wonder whether you wanted to talk a little bit about that. I know this is the regulatory environment you thought was particularly difficult if I'm about to or have started a transportation business.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the key difference between a traditional startup and a transportation startup is that you're heavily influenced by regulations. Because it's a sector that is just heavily regulated and sort of scrutinized because it has so many different stakeholders involved. So I think one really important thing that I think we touched upon tonight is that you really have to have the city buy-in. And that's something that in the past has been overlooked, but today you really see a trend of cities gaining back control, and rightly so, because they can't just be the petri dish of different mobility startups. So having this strategic alignment with cities and really making an effort to cooperate with cities, understand their issues, is something that for us is really, really key, and we really put a lot of emphasis on.
So bringing the audience, I guess, into the discussion, I'm particularly keen to hear from those that have questions. I think if you have a statement, you'd be more than welcome to see any of the panelists afterwards. But is there anyone that wishes to raise their hand, introduce themselves, where the business is from, and ask the question? Sir.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know, there's one thing we haven't touched upon is the affordability of transport. There's been a lot about raising a lot of money and capital, but surely public transport and TfL would have a big opinion about the affordability, and maybe people that have to work in not the tertiary sector, for example, who are working late at night, and the 24-hour tube doesn't really consider that at the minute. It's more the weekend and people who have a lot more money. What your thought might be on that, and maybe some of this disruptive methods of transport could help in terms of that.
I mean, of course, social inclusion and the efficient functioning of markets is totally the city's responsibility, and subsidy will always be needed in a transport system where income disparities and all the other things that are in our society need to be managed. So we can't totally privatise our mobility systems, and we can't just rely on selling infrastructure as a service to optimise our systems. We'll always need to balance out equality and equity considerations. So it's not to say that we need to keep subsidizing inefficient ways of moving people around, of which there are lots, such as empty buses. But of course, the fabric of our cities is absolutely fundamental.
Thank you. So in this evolution of mobility as a service, we talked a lot about who would be doing well in this evolution, who would be the winners, where are the opportunities. I guess my question is, who do you think might be the losers in this evolution in mobility as a service? For example, more and more young people are now not taking driver licenses. So would that be the traditional car manufacturers? When autonomous vehicles hit the road, would that be parking companies that might be the big losers because people no longer would have a personal car they would need to put somewhere? So who do you think will be the losers in this evolution?
Losers.
That's a tough one. No, I don't necessarily think there'll be big losers per se. Like when you look at things like big car manufacturers, I mean, they have the ability to adapt quite quickly. I mean, just the other day, BMW announced that they were going to start building electric scooters and stuff like that as well, right? So I think it's not necessary. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to be it's a long-term kind of change that will happen. So I think there'll be lots of time for kind of companies to adapt and evolve. I mean, things like parking companies, probably, you're right, but then they just need to stick in lots of electric car chargers and stuff like that, and I'm sure they'll find other revenue streams that will work for them. Well, get a partnership with an electric charging company.
But this is the risk with every big transition. Energy transition, digital transition. Now, for example, we're talking about the Green New Deal. One of the basic elements is green jobs. So it's the same with this transition. And we work with cities to support them and create this kind of long-term plans. And we see, for example, Washington, D.C., and D.C. has been lately at the vanguard of mobility technologies. And they have in their resilience strategy specific actions to address equity in relation to, for example, AI and autonomous vehicles? Is it like retraining programs to train again, or work with schools in specific communities, or with the traditional sector? So I think we see cities that are more, at this point, aware of what is coming and being able to create now the basic elements to address this kind of issues. Because the worst thing that can happen is we solve one thing and we create 1,000 new problems.
Yeah. No, I think if we see mobility as a service as being one of the greatest potential disruptions to a huge number of markets, because if you own the journey and you understand the journey purpose, you can almost, not for all cases, but disintermediate the destination. You will be owning people's travel choices and their decisions, and there will be some journeys for which you can offer something more competitive than the place they're going. So if you look at mobility as a service as a way to, not control, but manage our choices of how we spend our time and money, it's one of the biggest disruptive innovations there are at the moment.
Emily, I guess I do want to, bring you in on that losers question, because I wonder, from your perspective, as you assess and look at businesses, but also meet founding teams, there's probably a voice in your back of your head at times thinking, no, that's not going to work. And I just wonder, what's your perspective on that question of who are going to be the losers?
Yeah. No, I think it's a really good question, but frankly, I think that the market is in too much of a state of flux to really answer that question and give you clear, like, these are going to be the losers, because people are, I think all the stakeholders are looking at that change, and that's why you've got so many CVCs kind of investing on behalf of those companies, like my fund included. And so I think a lot of people are embracing the transition that we're having today, and it really depends on what to happen next, and how well we adapt to that transformation.
Okay, sir. No, if you can use the mic.
Hi, yeah. My question is around, I kind of look at the whole boom of the kind of app industry and the way that we're seeing micromobility coming together with the physical world, with the scooter sharing economy. My kind of question is, we all know what happened to Kodak when they kind of decided that they were going to ignore the digital revolution in terms of digital cameras. Apple came along and did the screen with the one button. I think we're kind of overdue that quantum leap in interface. We're all addicted to our phones, and I guess a lot of these services that we've talked about today are reliant on that app space being on that phone. My question is to the panel, what are your thoughts on what that next quantum shift could be? Elon Musk has talked about Neuralink and how he's going to release something in the next 18 months, which could be this idea of connecting us in some way. So my question is, what are the companies that you're, I guess, in touch with? What do you know, and what could you share in terms of what you think the next quantum shift could be? Because if those companies are not ahead of the game, they might be another Kodak moment for some of them.
Thank you, Jason.
I think Elon Musk has promised a lot of things recently. So we'll see how that shapes up. I don't know if it's a quantum leap or exactly the one that you're looking for, but I think one thing that is super interesting to us is the voice interface, and actually using that much more in our daily lives. So we've got one portfolio in our company, for instance, which actually called Flooper, which actually uses like transport-related questions to understand the speech, so that if you ask whatever device you have, oh, I want to get to that place, it will give you it will understand what you're saying very subtly, because currently the technology isn't really there in like Siri or Alexa. So I think we'll get much more attuned to speaking to our devices, whether that's a smartphone or anything else. And one instance that I find interesting is in travel, for instance, and how travel will be revolutionized by voice search. So for instance, for travel is an interesting example, because you've got an explosion of content currently, where you've got these really big OTAs that aggregate millions of hotels and attractions and tours, et cetera. But I really sort of think that we'll actually go to a state where we're sort of deleting all the noise, and you'll be able to tell your device, I want to go to Prague next weekend, find me, and your device will be able to sort of show you 3 options that are tailored to you, accustomed to you, and that you'll just be able to book seamlessly. So I think the voice search is something that really excites me for the future.
Any other quantum leaps that you mentioned? You saw the show. Okay. Any, sir?
Hello. There's been a lot of talk about the scooters and with regards to policy, about how the UK government's basically blocking the scooter adaptation in the UK. I'd be interested to see what the panel thinks about what the government could actually do to help adoption. Effectively, how cars can reach level 5 autonomy quicker. How the government recently also stopped doing the OLEV grant for FEVs in the UK as well. So, what steps the panel think the UK government to do to actually help adoption of these new technologies and new forms as well?
Well, maybe you should.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. I think the government at the moment, well, there's kind of very much a carrot and stick approach to lots of these things. So when you look at things like ULEZ, for example, it's very much a kind of, you must pay taxes to drive your car in London. I think what they are actually missing, to be honest, is a bit more of the carrot approach to encourage people to choose other forms of transport other than their car. Whether that is through things, obviously I'm not going to bang on about the fact that we can't operate here, but whether it is just being a little bit more open to new technologies to enable, just to give people another option to get around, I think is a key one. I mean, that would obviously be a good place to start from from my point of view. But I think, kind of less stick, more carrot approach would be good.
Okay, more vegetables. James, do you have anything?
Well, I just think, we ask a lot of our politicians and our policymakers to define kind of what success looks like for us, and we then expect it to be delivered. But after this, if we all try and agree, what does a good trip home look like for you guys, when it comes down to, I want this space or I want that asset and I want this experience, it's really hard to balance these needs. So it's all very well talking about optimizing these systems, getting more out of the same, and using data and technology, but we need to find new ways of managing what we want to happen in these systems. We can't rely on disruptive business models. We can't rely on investors in the private sector to do this. We need to think, what do we want the city to look like?
I think Elisa wanted to do at least one more question. Ma'am.
Hi, it's more of an observation rather than a question. We've come from Manchester today, and we got the train to Euston and scooted on our scooters to here. And we just found the experience so incredibly different to Manchester, which could be interesting. London is so much far ahead than anywhere else in the UK. And I just wanted to share that really today, because in front
What was
of you
different?
guys,
Yeah, exactly. What are those differences?
well, in terms of scooting specifically, we found a very easy and safe route. It wasn't stressful or dangerous in any way. And we scooted here from Euston in 20 minutes. Not going particularly quickly, nice and easy along the cycle routes and the back streets. In Manchester, that's just not possible because of the car traffic and lack of bike lanes in general. We've also been in touch with TfL and the DfT about scooting being on the radar of policy, whereas there's not really anything. And their main concern was safety, actually. So in influencing any policy, I just thought I'd, open the conversation with Harry and say,
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Their main concern is safety, and there's so much bad press because scooting is this new thing, and perhaps some people have fallen off, but it's like way lower than any car accidents or deaths. It's just like completely out of scale in the press. So I just wondered.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think obviously because it's new, and that it's transport. I mean, unfortunately, accidents are inevitable, right? Even if you get on a plane, or it is inevitable. Unfortunately, like we do a lot around this, obviously. So, for example, on the Bird app in the US, you can request a helmet, and we'll send one to you. In Europe, we don't have that functionality yet, but we do lots of events. So we do helmet giveaways where people can come and get a helmet for free in the cities that we work in. We limit the speed of our scooters as well, which is something quite interesting. So they can't go more than 15 miles an hour. Which is the average speed of a bike, really. In fact, even on the Olympic Park on my commute in the mornings, I get people whiz past me on their bikes. And I think we've done quite a big study into it, into safety, and we found it to be kind of on par with a bicycle. And I think what people forget is that 1 million people die in car-related incidents around the world every year. And I think unfortunately there's been a handful on scooters since we launched, but I think in 18 months there's been 4 or 5. So it is. I appreciate that we're not quite at the same scale as car trips, but
particularly in my route today, I didn't feel in any way in danger.
I mean, we've spent a lot of money in London on the infrastructure. So we spent billions of pounds on cycle superhighways and the cycling infrastructure network. And during commuting hours, they're full. And as soon as you're as soon as commuting hours are over, you always hear the cabbies complain that they're not being used enough, and it's causing traffic, and because there's only one lane down the embankment and stuff now. But I think if we were to legalise something like this, I mean, like we see in Paris, you see kind of men in suits going from meeting to meeting, just bouncing from place to place, because you can either do a mile in 3 minutes, or you can sit in the back of a taxi, one person in it polluting, and it'll take you 20 minutes to get there. So I mean, it really is it's a no-brainer and makes use of the existing infrastructure that we have.
One more observation was there are so many e-scooters on our route, and
Not
that
ours.
wasn't the case. That wasn't the case 6 months ago.
There's a lot. Yeah, we see a lot, you know, and obviously
They're not birds, but it's all
Yeah.
the journey towards change, isn't it?
Well,
So
exactly that, and I think,
people
you know,
are adopting it, and you've done amazingly well to,
Well.
you know, just like open people's eyes to the different, in the
Well,
diversity
good.
of micromobility. So,
good. Well, hopefully
well
it's a when, not if, then. But you know, we'll get there.
I think on that note.
Just to
Yeah.
be fair for Manchester, though, like the mayor of Greater Manchester has committed almost $1 billion to create this kind of very the beelines and connect everything and everyone with everything. So yeah, like cities have different starting points. True. Well, I mean, in 10 years we can connect, we can compare, and maybe Greater Manchester actually has much more, you know, sustainable mobility than London. There you are.
Yeah, I think Andy would have appreciated that, Lena. So I think, for my purposes, I think one thing that does come up is actually I am quite hungry, and I'm quite eager to meet the cheeky Indian, which apparently is what's for dinner. But before I guess close the discussion, I wanted to certainly thank the audience for coming. I think particularly any Workspace customers. I know the Workspace team are sitting at the back, and they're happy to raise their hands if they're so inclined. If anybody want to sort of have a conversation with anyone from Workspace, please go up and say hello. But more importantly, I'd like to invite the audience to thank the panel for their time.